Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a really provocative question. Was the West actually responsible for the 2014 crisis in Ukraine? We're going to break down the thesis from political scientist John Mearsheimer, and, it's a view that completely flips the script on the story most of us heard. So let's get right into it.
Okay, so first, let's just quickly go over the story that was pretty much everywhere in the news. When things in Ukraine really blew up back in early 2014, the explanation we got in the West was, honestly, pretty simple. It all boiled down to one guy and one country.
Right. The dominant narrative was crystal clear. This was all about Russian expansionism. The thinking was that Vladimir Putin was on a mission to rebuild some kind of greater Russia and that Ukraine was just his first target. This was the lens through which almost all Western policy was made.
But what if that's not the whole story? What if there's another way to look at it? Well, John Mearsheimer, who is a major figure in political science, came forward with a totally different analysis, one that basically turns that conventional wisdom on its head.
Mearsheimer's argument is, it's a complete 180. He says that the United States and its allies are the ones who are actually and principally responsible for the crisis. In his view, Russia wasn't the aggressor at all. It was reacting to what it saw as a direct threat growing right on its border. So how on earth does he make that case? Well, according to Mearsheimer, this whole thing didn't just pop up out of nowhere in 2014. He argues that the, quote, deep causes go way back to a three-part strategy the West started rolling out right after the Cold War ended.
And he calls this a three-pronged approach. The goal, as he saw it, was to basically, and methodically, peel Ukraine away from Russia's sphere of influence and pull it completely into the West. Each of these steps was a critical piece of that bigger geopolitical puzzle.
So you have NATO expansion as the military piece, right? And EU expansion as the economic piece. But Mearsheimer says you got to see them as two sides of the same coin. Then you add in democracy promotion, which, by the way, Russia saw as a playbook for regime change. And from Moscow's point of view, this looks like a full court press to turn Ukraine into a Western fortress.
So after two huge waves of NATO expansion in '99 and then 2004 that brought the alliance right up to Russia, the real breaking point in Mearsheimer's view was the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, because that's when NATO literally put it down in writing. Ukraine and Georgia will become members. For Russia, this was the ultimate red line.
And it's not like Russia was quiet about it. Mearsheimer points out that they made their opposition incredibly clear publicly at the time. Putin himself flat out called it a direct threat. So in Mearsheimer's analysis, the West heard this loud and clear, but just decided to push forward anyway.
Okay, so if that whole strategy was the deep cause, what was the final straw? The immediate trigger. Mearsheimer points to a really fast-moving series of events in late 2013 and early 2014 that basically lit the fuse.
So it all kicked off when Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, backed out of a huge trade deal with the EU, choosing a Russian deal instead. This sparked the massive pro-Western Maidan protests, things quickly spiraled into violence, a political deal to end it all fell apart, and Yanukovych fled the country as a pro-Western government took power. Mearsheimer controversially calls this a coup, and for him, that was the final trigger.
So in Mearsheimer's view, Russia's reaction, the swift takeover of Crimea and then fueling the conflict in eastern Ukraine, was a direct and, more importantly, a predictable response to what it saw as a Western-backed coup on its doorstep.
He explains that from Moscow's perspective, this was never about conquering new lands. It was about preventing a critically important buffer state from being swallowed up by a rival military alliance. And to make this point, he uses a really powerful analogy from American history. Okay, first just think about the United States' own Monroe Doctrine. For 200 years, it's been the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. It basically says the Western Hemisphere is America's backyard, and other big powers are not welcome to build military bases here. The U.S. has never, ever tolerated that.
Now, Mearsheimer asks this really provocative question. Just imagine, say 20 years from now, a powerful China tries to form a military alliance with Canada and Mexico. What do you think Washington would do? He argues the U.S. response would be immediate, absolute, and it certainly wouldn't be peaceful.
And that, he says, is exactly how a great power like Russia views NATO setting up shop in Ukraine. From his perspective, it was an entirely predictable reaction, based on rules of great power politics that have been around for centuries.
So if Western policy was the problem, according to Mearsheimer, what should have been the solution? Well, his proposal is all about recognizing these very same geopolitical realities.
He basically argues for turning back the clock. The West should just formally state that Ukraine will not join NATO.
Then all sides should work together to make Ukraine a neutral buffer state, not aligned with anybody. He says this should be backed by a joint economic plan that includes Russia and would also require protecting minority rights inside Ukraine to help calm things down.
Now, the crucial point here, from his perspective, is that this isn't just about giving Russia what it wants. He argues that this is actually the best possible outcome for the Ukrainian people themselves. It would save their country from being completely wrecked as a battlefield in a great power tug-of-war.
And this really brings us to the heart of his argument. It's a clash between two totally different ways of seeing the world. On one side, you've got the 21st century West, which believes in spreading liberal, democratic values. And on the other, you have a Russia that, he argues, is still playing by 19th century rules of cold hard power politics and spheres of influence.
Ultimately, Mearsheimer's analysis forces all of us to ask a really fundamental question about how the world actually works. Did the old rules of power politics ever really go away? Or did the West just forget about them, with absolutely disastrous consequences for Ukraine? And that's the provocative question right at the heart of his entire thesis.